The Great Salt Lake in the state of Utah, from what I understand, is the largest body of saline water in the Western Hemisphere. There are three rivers that drain into the Great Salt Lake: the Bear, the Weber, and, interestingly enough, the Jordan. Not the same one from the Middle East, but these three rivers drain into that, and they carry more than 1.1 million tons of salt annually to the Great Lake. It is estimated, and I guess science has confirmed this to the extent that it can, that the dissolved mineral accumulation at the basin of the lake is over 5 billion tons. No wonder it is called the Great Salt Lake. And yet we understand that salt, this basic component that we all are familiar with and has been a familiar component to mankind since mankind, that Jesus uses it as an illustration of his followers. Jesus tells us that that's what you and I are. And Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, just this part of a sentence, you are, Jesus says to his disciples, ultimately to you and me, you are the salt of the earth. You know, we use that expression in many ways, even when we aren't necessarily referring to something biblical or something that involves Christianity. Maybe you've heard the expression sometimes, a certain name is brought up about a certain family or a certain individual, and someone will remark about that person, so-and-so, he's the salt of the earth. He's good salt, and we're complimenting that person, and I would assume here that Jesus is paying a high compliment and setting a high standard and a high bar for his followers. You are the salt of the earth. You know, he then warns, and we'll talk about this at the end of the lesson, if the salt loses its flavor or savor or its potency, how then or shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. But we want to think for just a few minutes in the heart of the lesson here about you are the salt of the earth. As a Christian, we have this obligation to live up to the standard that Jesus has set, this compliment in some ways, but this very high bar that Jesus has set for us, that we are the salt of the earth. And so what I want us to do in the heart of the lesson is think about three things that we understand are related to salt and how those apply to Christianity. And we want to think about three things that salt teaches us about, we would say, the power, we might phrase it that way, the power of salt. These are three special qualities, three special characteristics of salt. And if there are characteristics and qualities of salt, then we're going to make the application to you and me as children of God. Number one, the power of purity. Salt was known as a purifying substance. It still is known that way. Salt was known for its antiseptic quality as well, but the idea here of purity. In the Roman world, they said, which was the time in which Jesus lived, the Romans said, and the Greeks also said, that salt was a valuable commodity, a valuable substance, because basically the idea of the purity that it is regarded by the Greeks and the Roman is that it was made of the two purest things in their mind, the sea and the sun. Because you took the water out and you let the sun evaporate the water, and there is the salt. And the fact that refined salt, as we think about it today, is very white, but even then salt had a white quality to it, not quite as refined as perhaps we would find in the little Morton, salt container. But still, just seeing something like that was white and pure and had this characteristic of it that being made of the sea and the sun, in the Greek mind and the Roman mind, it was something that was very special to them, and it represented the power of purity. And as it would glisten and as it would be white, we can understand how this would be something that they would regard very highly. In fact, when you look back at some of the ancient cultures and the pagan gods, salt was often a sacrifice to them. And that's not even, or you even read about that in the Scripture. In Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13, it talks about sacrifices need to be salted with salt. Jesus refers to this. In Mark chapter 9, the last two verses of that chapter, verses 49 and 50, Jesus refers to apparently Leviticus 2, and he says that the sacrifices are salted with salt. And that, I think, is because of the quality and the characteristic and the view of salt being purity and having this pureness of it. It's not diluted down or watered down or put with anything else. It is what it is in and of itself. It has this purity to it that is not found anywhere else. Unfortunately, the world that we live in, the country that we live in, is not always very pure. And we see a lack of purity. And we see a lack of the power of purity in our world. There is, I guess, what you might call a lowering of the standards. If the bar is set here, as we're talking about Jesus setting the bar so high and the standards so high, and if one of the qualities and characteristics of salt is the power that it has and of purity, and if Jesus says, you're the salt of the earth, that represents that characteristic, that quality of life that you and I should have and spread in the world of purity, but there's a lowering of the bar. There's a lowering of the standards. Look at our world today and think about how lowered the standards have become in the respect of honesty, ethics, work in and of itself, moral standards, conscientiousness. Think how so many of those standards that have biblical basis to them have been lowered so that they're not really powerful anymore because they're not pure anymore. And the world's standards have diluted the purity. You and I as Christians are called the salt of the earth. We are to maintain the purity and not fall victim to the temptation to lower our standards. You know, sometimes as a child of God we say, well, you know, everybody else is living this way and it's accepted this, and so we're just going to bring ourselves down with everybody else. Maybe we don't do that so much deliberately. Maybe it's even subconsciously sometimes, and I think perhaps the deception of the devil weaves itself into our fooling ourselves into thinking that, well, as long as we stay just a little better than or a little more elevated than the world, then we're okay. But we don't realize that maybe we have lowered ourselves, not quite as low as the standard of the world, but we've lowered ourselves from the standard of God. You see, we're measuring ourselves in regard to purity by the wrong standard. Sometimes we say, just as long as we're not as bad as the world, we're okay. Well, maybe there's some merit in that, but it's backwards. It's the wrong way to measure. It's not that we take it from the negative standpoint of, well, as long as we don't get as bad as the world, as long as we're just a little better than the world, then we're okay. That's not the standard. The standard is not down here at the world. The standard is up here with God. And rather than seeing how close we might get to the bottom without actually hitting it, why don't we see how close we can get to the top and try to hit it? Why don't we shoot for, as the goal of our living, the purity and exercising the power of purity in this world of sin and sorrow? You and I have something that so many in the world do not have, but desperately want to have. Why don't we share it with them? We are not supposed to be pure so that we can be arrogant, so that we can look down on people, so that we can criticize people, so that we can compare ourselves with them to say, look how much better we are. But we are pure because we're trying to be an example of Jesus. We're pure because we're trying to be an example of holiness and godliness, because we want other people to have what we have. You see, salt, when Jesus calls us the salt of the earth, there's that power there of purity that you and I need to have and show to the world. The Bible tells us in James chapter 1, verse 27, pure and undefiled religion, pure and undefiled religion. You want a definition of pure and undefiled religion? Well, how about a Bible definition? James 1:27, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. And look at the last part of the verse, and keep oneself unspotted, unstained, unsoiled by the world. We live a different life because we want to live a pure life, an undefiled life, a life that is described as the salt of the earth. Secondly, we think about the power of preservation. First, there is the power of purity, but then there is the power of preservation. You see, salt is a preservative. Particularly before the days of modern refrigeration and what we're used to with all the preservatives that are put into our food. You know, I said I don't understand maybe necessarily why you even have to embalm most people today, because we've eaten so many preservatives. We'll stay, in the shape we are for another 100 years after we die. And yet, salt is regarded as a preservative. Part of that is because it does have this characteristic, this quality about it of purity, but there is the power when Jesus calls us the salt of the earth. The characteristic, the quality is not only about purity, but it's also about preservation. Before people had refrigerators and things like that, families would store their meats in the smokehouse and the meat house, and it would be rubbed down and saturated with salt. It would last longer. It wouldn't spoil as quickly because the salt would help to preserve the meat. It would help to preserve and avoid natural decay that the meat would have. The world around us is in decay. The world around us is falling apart. Romans chapter 8, verse 21 describes the world as one of corruption. And you may recall the reading that Brian had for us a few minutes ago from 2 John chapter 2, verse 17. The world is what? Passing away. You see, the world is not preserving itself. The world is not saving itself. The world is decaying. The world is passing away. The world is dying. The world is corrupting. The world is rotting on the vine. And yet you and I, as children of God, have a description of us by Jesus of salt of the earth, and the description that should fit us, that should describe us, the characteristic that you and I should have is to help preserve godliness and holiness in this world. We ought to be a preservative in contrast to the decay that is around us. We ought to help save that which is dying. And I mean the souls of lost men. I mean we need to do all that we can to preserve people for all eternity. We need to be helping to save those who are lost. And we need to be the preservative that the world needs. It is a sad and sorrowful thing to see how the world is dying and decaying before our very eyes. And I mean spiritually. I mean, spiritually speaking, the world is falling apart. Spiritually speaking, the world needs someone to save it. That someone is Jesus. Souls need to be saved. Lost people need to be saved. Lost people need to be preserved. You and I, as the salt of the earth, can spread our influence to stop the decay, to stop the rotting, to stop the dying, to save the souls of those who are lost. You and I have a great responsibility to come to the rescue of those who are lost and dying, and those who need salvation through faith and obedience to Jesus Christ. There's kind of an interesting story that is told about this idea of salt being a preservative, and that it relates to the fact that in the latter part of the verse, Matthew 5:13, Jesus says, sometimes the salt loses its ability. It loses its savor. It completely wears out. There's an understanding that may be a reference to the fact that in ancient days, sometimes the outdoor ovens that were built had tile linings in them on the base, and the fire was underneath that. And between the tile and the fire, there was often put a layer of salt to kind of help keep the tiles from having the direct contact with the heat. But over time, as the fire continued to burn and was burned on a regular basis, the salt itself would become corrupt and no longer able to kind of act like an insulator right there and preserve the tiles. And so eventually, the salt would be dug out of that oven and replaced with new salt and tiles put back on it. And that old salt that had done its great job as a preservative for so long was now, as Jesus says, what? Good for nothing but as pothole filler. Brothers and sisters, as children of God, we've got to be better than pothole filler. We've got to be a preservative to keep the decay of the moral degradation and loss in our society and help Jesus work through us to save the lost. But there's one more characteristic, one more quality about salt that I think we can talk about. There's the power of purity, the power of preservation, but there is also the power of pleasantness. And we think about that from the standpoint not so much of salt being used in these huge quantities to rub down meat and so on and keep it from rotting away or anything of that nature. But think about sometimes how the food you eat, while well prepared and fresh and made by loving hands, needs just a little something extra to give it that oomph. And oftentimes, what is that? Just a little bit of salt. Now, we went to a restaurant the other day, and I ate some French fries, and I didn't put any extra salt on them because they came well salted. In fact, I think if you had a heart condition after about the fourth fry, you need to call the paramedics. My father-in-law, God rest his soul, such a good, godly man who gave me such a wonderful wife and had such a wonderful family. Salt was his thing. No matter what meal, no matter who cooked it, if it was at home, in a restaurant, whatever, as soon as the plate was set down, he never tasted anything. He just picked up the salt shaker and did the 360 about 4 times. And salted everything. I guess it tasted good to him. And then again, the whole thing about salt being bad for you, and you know, you'll die of a heart attack. He lived to be over 95. So maybe the preservative element was kicking in with him. I don't know. But salt adds flavor. Salt has a pungency to it that in the right quantity, at the right time, in the right place, makes things taste better, makes things more pleasant. And as children of God, we are to have this quality about us. Yes, there's purity, and yes, there's preservation, but as children of God, we need to be pleasant people who add a little flavor to the world. Colossians chapter 4, verse 6 says, "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you might know how you ought to answer each one." In other words, we need to think sometimes when we're talking with one another and put a little salt in it. Let our speech be seasoned with salt, filled with grace, so that when we speak to one another, we edify, we build up, and we help and we encourage rather than the opposite. And we think about this even further in regard to how pleasantness ought to be a quality and a characteristic of us as Christians, that there's no reason for us as Christians. I mean, I know we all have bad days sometimes. We all have things that are out of our control, and we have a bad day. But the overall characteristic of us being called salt of the earth means that most of the time, we ought to make the world a better place. And most of the time, we ought to make the world a more pleasant place because we're in it. It is said that one of our former justices of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, once wrote, "I might have entered the ministry if certain clergymen," as he would have used it, certain in the ministry, "I knew had not looked and acted so much like undertakers." Robert Louis Stevenson, the famous author of Another Era, once wrote in his diary, and he wrote it like he was recording something spectacular, something extraordinary. Robert Louis Stevenson once wrote, "I have been to church today and am not depressed." You and I, as children of God, need to add the pleasantness, the flavor, the taste to the world. And because you and I, as Christians, are in the world, then the world should be a better place because of our Christian behavior and our Christian influence. We have a world that is filled with people who don't have joy. We have a world that is filled with people who are distressed and dealing with difficulties from every direction. There is sorrow. There is hate. You and I, overall, need to have this characteristic and quality of being the salt of the earth to make this world that's filled with sorrow and hate filled with joy and love. Because we're the salt of the earth. And we want to make the world a better place, and we want to make the world more pleasant. We want to diffuse the joy in our world. We want to be the ones who help the world be a better place because we are in it. Leave it better than you found it. You go into a room and there's difficulty there. I hope by the grace of God and the wisdom that He gives each and every one of us, we can leave it better than we found it. We may not always be able to solve everyone's problems. We may not always be able to make everything right that needs to be made right, that's out of our control. But I hope in some way, because we are the salt of the earth, that we can leave it better than we found it. Isn't that what Jesus did? He came to this world of sin and sorrow. And he left it better than he found it. You and I are called to do the same because we are the salt of the earth. And so we think about the invitation of Christ now with the heart of the lesson and these three characteristics in our minds. Jesus warns at the end, the salt can lose its potency. The salt can lose its flavor and power. And then it's good for nothing just to be thrown out. I hope our Christianity and our Christian influence, our Christian behavior, our Christian mindset will never be diluted or neutralized to the point that it's no longer effective, to the point that it no longer works. We must work against sin and the temptations of this world, that we do not compromise the power of being the salt of the earth, that we do not compromise and weaken and dilute the influence that we have. Salt, to be effective, must be pure. Otherwise, it's just to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. There was an interesting tradition, perhaps is the way to say this, but an interesting practice among some of the Jews in their synagogues back in the days of Jesus and a little before. If someone had left the faith and then repented and returned, and they made their change of direction known at the synagogue. Remember, this is the Jewish faith. But they made themselves known at the synagogue. I want to come back again. I've been so ineffective and unfaithful. I want to come back again. The interesting little tradition in some synagogues was this. When the person repented and was restored, they would actually lie down at the door of the synagogue and let the people who were going through the door step on them. Symbolic of what Jesus said, and symbolic of what was known about salt even to the Jews before Jesus said it. That if you're going to live the wrong kind of life, then you're good for nothing but just to be on the ground and stepped on. But to the person who wanted to restore, and he would lay there and take that kind of treatment to remind him, don't go back into the world again. Don't be lost again, because this is the end result. Be good for something. Be worth your salt. Remember your power of the purity and the preservation and the pleasantness that you can bring to the world. Today, if you are not a child of God and you've never obeyed the gospel, we extend the opportunity for you to come in faith, repenting of your sins, confessing Jesus as the Son of God, to be buried in baptism, in the waters of baptism, to be immersed in His name and added to His church to become the salt of the earth. If you, as the salt of the earth, have lost your effectiveness, you've been diluted by the world, be restored. Come back again. Let Jesus forgive you, will forgive you, and walk faithfully with Him again. Will you come as we stand and we sing?